Self-blame is stealing your youth and your freedom, and it's time that we talk about it because there's a particular kind of shame that is often ignored. It's not the shame of something that happened to you, it's the shame of realizing I helped create this. We talk an endless amount about forgiving the people who have been harmful in our lives, letting go of toxic bosses, quitting the bad relationship, or forgiving our parents for doing the best that they could. But I found the hardest person to forgive is myself. And it's because I feel like I stayed too long. I ignored red flags and worst of all, for enjoying the prestige and the perks of the situation before it turned toxic. I've told myself, you made your bed. Now it's time to lie in it. Who am I to complain? Who am I to act brand new? So today we're dismantling the culpability trap. Sometimes the best way to take responsibility isn't to try and fix what broke, it's to start building your exit ramp. Consider this your permission slip. Permission to admit when your past self made a deal that your current self has outgrown, and permission to walk away even when your pride takes a hit. This is Unpopular Decisions, where we talk about what it really takes to choose yourself, even when it's not popular. I'm your host, Jameelah Calhoun. If you've been enjoying our show, the best way to support our work is free and only takes 4 seconds. Follow or subscribe wherever you're listening right now and leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them next. In today's season 2 finale, it's just me again. Season 2 has really shaken the tables, and we've gone into deeper conversations than ever before around decisions that many of us never speak aloud, even after they work out. From suing your former employer, to being the victim of a dating scam, to becoming a teen mother, to terminating a pregnancy. These stories were so powerful, but they also made me start to ask myself why. Why are these the decisions that carry an additional expectation of secrecy? I realized that all of these decisions shared one factor: partial responsibility. How do you forgive yourself when you weren't just a victim? You also participated. Unspoken decisions carry secrecy not because we're guilty, but because our pride is at stake. This episode isn't for people who think everything was their fault. We know it wasn't. And if you're still wondering, I'm here to tell you it definitely wasn't. But this is for those of us who still can't stop replaying what we could have done differently. Let's get into it. You've heard me talk about the toxic job that I stayed in for 18 months after I knew it wasn't working, how I tried to self-care my way through it. And I've also shared with you the deeper, honest reason for why I stayed for so long. It's because I became the golden executive. I was praised by leadership and they trusted me with projects that seemed impossible. I was getting promoted and praised and I soaked up the recognition. What I haven't talked as much about was my prior marriage and divorce. I got married at 24, right before I went to business school, which sounds insane to me now. I feel like a child bride, and I side-eye my parents for not putting a stop to the delusion. But you know how it is. I thought I was grown. I thought I had it figured out. But the reality was we were incompatible and we were young, making decisions independently instead of as a unit. I was the primary breadwinner despite being so young myself, yet I received little romance and emotional support in return. At the same time, I was the one getting married while most of my friends were still single. I arrived on my business school campus with a partner, which, if anyone's been to business school or grad school, they make a big deal about. A lot of people are moving to new cities to follow their partner's careers. It felt good to be chosen, to be part of the married club, and to feel like I'd beaten the odds as a Black woman in America finding a stable partner. This was around the time where there were so many studies coming out on OkCupid and all these other sites about the fact that Black women were much less likely to get married. And so I felt like I had won a prize. In psychology, Sigmund Freud had a term for this called secondary gains. And I know every once in a while I start dropping these random psychology, intellectual stuff, but walk with me here. It basically says that sometimes we stay in painful situations because the pain is buying us something that we want. Sometimes it's an ego stroke. Sometimes it's sympathy. Sometimes it's literally money. And hey, that's important too. It means that while our primary experience maybe isn't great for us, there's a secondary thing that keeps us stuck. For my job, my primary experience was burnout, stress, and high blood pressure. But my secondary gain was feeling indispensable, feeling validated, and getting to be the hyper competent fixer again. And like I've shared before, that's my happy place. That's the role I played since I was a child. For my marriage, my primary experience was being taken for granted, financial stress, and not having a shared vision of our future. But my secondary gain was status, pride, and avoiding the insecurity of being on my own. Basically, I was proud of this relationship and I was willing to allow myself to be exploited for a time because I was profiting from the prestige. I was willing for a time to be unhappy in my marriage because I was benefiting from the status. Sometimes the hardest thing to admit isn't that we're suffering. It's that our suffering is actually serving us. And that is the trap. When the environment at my company eventually turned hostile and I went from golden child to scapegoat, my pride was decimated. And when I was deciding to end my marriage after I had chosen it enthusiastically, I was embarrassed because if I'm honest, I had seen the subtle cracks early on and I chose to rationalize them because I wanted the dream and because I believed that I could fix or manage anything that came up. And if anyone else was raised by an immigrant parent who tried to raise you to anticipate anything that could go wrong, having a situation like this where I ultimately couldn't predict the future, that I ultimately couldn't fix or paper over anything that came up later just really shook my own confidence in myself. So when the job and marriage reached a point where it was no longer working and no longer healthy, the guilt was paralyzing. I kept telling myself, you picked this. You bragged about this life. And I didn't want to turn around now and say that it was a mistake. Making mistakes just wasn't a part of my self-concept. The hardest part then wasn't just leaving, it was admitting that I had traded health for praise and I had traded my self-worth for status. That's something I know I'm not alone in, even though it is really hard to admit. Because honestly, I'm listening to myself. I'm like, oh, what a douche. She doesn't think she makes mistakes. Like, hello. But this dynamic actually reminded me of a scene in Devil Wears Prada, the first one. I recently watched Devil Wears Prada 2 on a flight, which is honestly exactly where that movie deserves to be watched. Entertaining, but it's a plain watch. But there's that iconic scene in the first movie where Andy is complaining about Miranda Priestley's emotional abuse and toxicity. Nigel looks at Andy and says, "You're not trying, you're whining. Millions of girls would kill for this job." That's it. The idea of feeling like one of the lucky ones, like this was a opportunity that you have to seize. Andy didn't stay because she was afraid of Miranda, but at some point she got seduced by the prestige. She loved being the girl who could pull off the impossible task and get the Harry Potter unreleased edition for Miranda's daughters. She loved working her network of hot guys. She also loved wearing the designer outfits. Honestly, I would have folded for the outfits too because she was really eating that up. But the point is that people like us who struggle to forgive themselves the most are often the ones who can clearly see how they participated in their own circumstance. This took me back to some of the words that have stayed with me after my conversation with Dion Dawson. We spoke with him in our episode 10 of season 2. And he was describing his emotional state after finding himself homeless, sleeping in his car, and working overnight shifts at Amazon. Let's hear from him again describing this experience. You had alluded to the fact that when you came out of the military, you had done all this amazing journalism work, but then struggled to find your place. What were the parts of your identity that was tested during that particular
Everything.
moment?
It was,
yeah.
I'll tell you, I came back and there were stints where I was homeless. I was sleeping in my car. It was one of the hardest things because it wasn't like when I was homeless when I was a kid. You know what I mean? When you're homeless as a kid and you're trying to figure things out, you ask God, why is this happening to me? When you're an adult, you ask God, how did I do this to myself? And it was something that I had to wrestle with. It was extremely painful because there was no one to blame. You know what I mean? There was no plan. I didn't know that was the blank slate at which I had to paint the canvas. Up until then, life was painted for me. I didn't have an opportunity to decide anything. It was always reactive. It was always survival. But this last decade out of a 36-year-old guy's journey has been about what I decided to do.
How did I do this to myself? Damn. When he said that, I was shook because it's so true. It made me realize that adulthood gives us agency, but once we have agency, then we gain blame too. We take our own agency and weaponize it against ourselves. Ultimately, it can be a way that we feel like we don't deserve to change. We don't deserve to pivot because we made a choice. We decided to take the job, to sleep with that person, to sign that contract, or to move to that city sight unseen. Then we decided that any suffering that came after those decisions were entirely our fault. We turned self-blame into this prison sentence that has no parole. That's exactly what ate at me for years after ending my marriage. Leaving my marriage didn't just mean grieving my relationship. It also meant losing my identity as a wife and frankly, the status of that as well. But what really rocked me was this feeling that my self-trust had been wounded. If I could be so wrong as to choose this wrong relationship and take it all the way to the altar, what else could I be wrong about? Sometimes we're not grieving the relationship or the job that hasn't worked out. We're grieving the version of ourselves that believed that it would. As someone who was the golden child, used to being praised for being an old soul, wise beyond my years, I started to question everything. If I did this to myself, could I even trust my judgment? Hey, real quick, before we dive back into this story, if this episode is hitting a nerve, you're nodding along, or feel like we're singing the story of your life with our words, take 5 seconds right now to hit that follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening. When you subscribe, rate the show, or text this episode to a friend, it genuinely helps us reach more people and inspire more brave life choices. All right, let's get back into it. And that question of judgment and self-trust came up in so many conversations from season 2. Especially our conversation with Tracy Hall, who was a victim of a dating scam. She was a tech executive responsible for budgets of millions of dollars at her job. And yet she could not have fathomed that she would be someone who would lose over $300,000 to a scam in her personal life. It made her question everything. And she said in that episode that shame made her feel even more lonely. She had to work on forgiving herself and understanding how she was actually manipulated into that situation. We also heard it in the story from Alexandra. Even though many things were potentially beyond her control, even she mentioned how she wished she had listened to the signs sooner, that she had started planning her exit sooner. And then we have Becky. She crossed state lines at 17 to have an abortion for a pregnancy she knew she didn't want and she knew would change the trajectory of her life. Of course, she was young, but she still says that she felt responsible in some ways for the choice that she had made. But that choice shouldn't have come with a life sentence. This is where Becky's own words from season 2, episode 11, changed my brain chemistry. Abortion is one of the most politically, socially, and profoundly emotionally charged decisions that a woman can make. Becky terminated 2 pregnancies and reflected on how society treats people who makes mistakes. She brought up an analogy that has stayed with me ever since.
I felt like a failure. I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed. I felt all of those things, not about ending the pregnancy, but about getting pregnant, right? I was a smart girl. I had a big future and I did something dumb, and I did know better. And yet for a whole host of reasons, I was victim to all of the things that patriarchy does to young women. that ended up contributing to that situation I was in. Now, people can say it's because I made a mistake and I should have to suffer those consequences of my mistake. But I also think that is really unfair in that if someone who was 17 made the decision to ride a motorcycle without a helmet and had some sort of horrible experience where, they needed some sort of an emergency care to keep them from being paralyzed, we don't look at them and say, well, you were stupid. You knew better. So now you have to suffer the consequences of these actions when there is a medical intervention that could help prevent that and ruin the rest of your life. And I look at this very much the same. Yes, I did something dumb. There were reasons that let's also not forget, I was 17. I didn't even have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. So let's say I rode my motorcycle without a helmet and there was a devastating consequence to that. There was also a medical procedure available to save my life from going down a path that would have forever altered it in a way that, in my opinion, would have been much for the worse. I wouldn't have been able to go to college. I would have been forever tied to a person with whom I had very little relationship, had no interest in being tied to for the rest of my life. I would have also then harmed my mom, who would have had to have been very involved financially in all other ways. But I couldn't tell people. There's so much stigma attached to this thing that the kid in the helmet would not be not telling people, right? But I couldn't. And that exacerbates everything because then I was alone. When you are made to feel shame about something, you don't talk about it, which only makes the loneliness feel even worse and then compounds the shame. It took me a long time to get out of that.
That motorcycle example is truly profound. And I didn't need that example to already have empathy for women who are making decisions about their bodies, but it helped give myself permission to think about all my various decisions through a new light. We do not deny care to the person who rode their motorcycle without a helmet. So why do we deny ourselves care? Why do we tell ourselves that because we ignore the red flags, because we were impulsive, because we spoke up, or because we decided to walk away from something without a safety net, that all of a sudden we don't deserve a happy ending? We don't deserve an exit ramp. I found it fascinating that car accidents came up as metaphors in both of our episodes on pregnancy loss. Elisabeth from episode 12, part 2 of our A Tale of Two Abortions series, noted that there was a single question her husband asked her that finally gave her clarity. It was a moment where she needed to make a decision about whether to terminate a pregnancy where she had one twin that was no longer with them and another twin who would have been born with significant challenges. And he asked her, what would you want me to do if you happened to be in a terrible car accident and you were on life support? Her answer was clear immediately. She would have wanted a merciful passing and for him to pull the plug. We do not deny dignity and mercy to someone who has suffered an injury, regardless of how it happened. And I think Elisabeth's story is also one that reminds us all that even if you had done everything perfectly, sometimes there's still circumstances that are beyond our control. Overall, these conversations reminded me mercy isn't reserved for innocent people. Mercy is for people who made mistakes too. And you can be partially responsible without being fully deserving of every consequence. I think one of the hardest parts of changing your life is realizing you weren't completely innocent. Shame says, I did this to myself. Victimhood says, I had no choice. But neither is actually healing, and neither is usually true. So if any of this is hitting for you, I wanted to leave us behind with something that can help us move from self-blame and into self-authorship. You know, a framework is coming. This is what I'm calling the Culpability-to-Grace Audit. It's a 4-step process to free yourself from the choices that you've outgrown or you feel like you've participated in. Step 1 is the incentive audit. This is listing those Freudian secondary gains. Write down everything your past self was getting out of the deal. Status, financial security, feeling needed, societal approval. Healing requires that we stop pretending that we were just helpless bystanders and forgive your past self for having those basic needs for approval and security. Step 2 is the helmet principle. This is where we decouple fault from care. Even if you rode the motorcycle without a helmet and ignored the red flags in the interview or the dating stage, you still deserve emergency care and you still deserve a parachute out of there. So triage yourself. What are you suffering from right now? In what ways is continuing to stay in your situation causing harm? The third piece is the pride check. If no one knew you ever made this decision, what would you do now to remedy it? What plan would you start to build if your ego wasn't involved? And another reframe that I found really powerful is, instead of thinking of everyone who might judge you, think of some of the people who might be inspired by you. And the last step is the absolution pivot. Write your absolution statement. And it's this exact line. This is what I wrote to myself when I needed to finally walk away from my marriage and say no to staying at that job. I made a deal based on who I was and what I needed then. I am allowed to break the deal based on who I am becoming and what I deserve now. I'll say that again. I made a deal based on who I was and what I needed then. I am allowed to break that deal based on who I am becoming and what I deserve now. You can write all of this, steps 1 through 4, in a letter to yourself. Here's the thing. The opposite of victimhood isn't self-blame. It's self-compassion. And compassion isn't something you earn by being innocent. Maybe you stayed too long. Maybe you married the wrong person. Maybe you ignored your instincts. Maybe your pride got the better of you. Mine certainly did. But here's what I hope we all remember. You can take responsibility without giving yourself a life sentence. Going back to Devil Wears Prada and that famous Nigel scene, it wasn't really about shaming Andy. He was really telling her, you say you're trapped, but you're still choosing it. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Millions of girls would kill for that job. And sometimes when we're staying, we have to own that we're staying because we're getting something from it that we want. The great part is that once you own your own agency in staying and in your decision, you can reclaim it. That's actually what Nigel was offering her. Not judgment, but agency to make a different choice if that's really what she wanted. At the end of the movie, when Andy is walking away from it all, it's an empowering message because once she owned her part in it, the part of herself that was enjoying the prestige and the outfits again, she could make a conscious choice to do something different. She could chuck that phone into the fountain, let go of the secondary gains, and come back to herself. Forgiveness isn't pretending you weren't part of the story. It's refusing to believe that what you are experiencing right now has to be the ending. Admitting that a situation no longer works, especially one you chose proudly in the beginning, isn't a failure of intelligence or judgment. It's a profound act of bravery. Your pride might take a scratch, but your freedom will stay intact. And that's what really matters. So that's it for this episode. And that's it for season 2 of Unpopular Decisions. We will be taking a break from our regular full-length episodes during the month of August, and new episodes will start up again on Tuesday, September 1st. During the break, we'll be bringing you replays of our favorite episodes, deleted scenes, and I'll be answering behind-the-scenes questions from you, our audience. Check out the show notes for a link to submit your questions, and you don't want to miss these fun episodes during our break. If something in this conversation resonated with you, please share it with a friend who's currently holding themselves hostage because of a past decision. Make sure to follow and subscribe on Popular Decisions wherever you get your podcasts. We are on a mission to spark 1 million brave life choices. And forgiving yourself for the choices that are no longer serving you is where it all begins. Thank you for listening, and I'm glad you're here.